In the late 1950s, Royal Dutch Shell and British Petroleum established the first crude oil extraction facility in Nigeria, in a region home to fishing villages and subsistence agriculture. The oil industry expanded its presence in the Niger Delta as the price of oil grew through the 1960s and especially through the 70s, when Nigeria benefited immensely from the OPEC oil embargo, which artificially made oil prices skyrocket. Unfortunately, despite these oil contracts being at least somewhat lucrative for the federal government of Nigeria, and especially lucrative for the corrupt Nigerian oligarchs, the sharing arrangement imposed on the states of the Niger Delta has left many locals wanting more. This is actually a common problem in countries that have resources distributed unequally amongst states. The states that have little resources want an even split from the states with resources. Conversely, the states that own the resources and bear the cost of mining those resources generally want an uneven split in their favour. A major factor in who won Nigeria's civil war, which ran from 1967 through to 1970, was which side had control over the oil in the Niger Delta. The mostly unrecognised state of Biafra was situated very close to oil resources, but the mostly conscripted Nigerian army did an impressive job of defending the oil pipelines, and thus were able to get the revenue needed to keep fighting and end up winning the war. Conversely, if Biafra were to have access to that oil revenue, it would have feasibly been able to set up a state with that oil revenue. And as an aside, I should note that British Petroleum never spoke out against the British government's blockade of Biafra that starved millions of people to death, including millions of children. Currently, there are many militias around Nigeria, especially in the Niger-Benue confluence, that being like a confluence of water, who fight to maintain access to oil pipelines from which they steal oil. This is a very controversial issue whose causes are contested. Shell BP is not known for having a large local workforce compared to the amount of profit that they make from extracting Nigerian oil. Shell especially does not have the cleanest record in terms of avoiding being complicit in murder. In 2009, Shell settled out of court, giving many millions of dollars to the family of Ken Saro-Wiwa. Ken was one of the Ogoni Nine, and the Ogoni Nine protested against the practices of Shell and found themselves executed by the Nigerian military government. Saro-Wiwa's family alleged that Shell was complicit in the murder of Ken. Shell paid the family $15.5 million, but still claimed that they had nothing to do with Ken's death. Two of the original witnesses admitted to lying to the court in a way that supported Shell. Shell had apparently offered them jobs at the company. So the argument from some in the militias is that there is no alternative work that is worth their while, and that what they are doing is not terrible given what Shell does in terms of polluting the local environment and maybe being complicit in murder. They also see the oil companies as being to blame for no jobs being available in the area, given that they earn massive revenues from extracting that oil. So, what do the militias do? The militias kill people within their own militia to maintain organisational hierarchy, and they also kill people outside their militia to obtain and retain turf. In 2003, Nigeria estimated an average of 1,000 people were dying from violence in the Niger Delta every year. Environmental damage in the Delta is some of the worst in the world, and the spills in the Delta shouldn't really be thought of as spills. A spill is something that is accidental. It's something that gets cleaned up almost immediately. That is not what is happening in the Niger Delta. In the Niger Delta, spills can be actively pumping oil into the environment for months, sometimes over a year, and almost never get properly cleaned up. These spills kill local ecosystems and subsistence sources that local populations have relied on for centuries. The other environmental damage comes from cooking crude oil. Cooking separates petrol from kerosene and diesel and is done by the militias to maximise profit. It also pumps incredible amounts of soot into the air, which covers all the local buildings in the area and is breathed in by locals, giving lung cancer and even earlier deaths. And the Nigerian life expectancy is actually already quite low at only 52 years and 10 months. One more actor group worth mentioning in the economic wars over oil are terrorist protest organisations. One such organisation is the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, MEND. Headed by Tom Polo, one of the group's representatives told the BBC that, quote, "Our aim is to totally destroy the capacity of the Nigerian government to export oil." The group purports to be standing against exporting oil and unequal distribution of Nigeria's resources. It has engaged in sabotage, theft, property damage, guerrilla warfare, and kidnapping in order to do this. The end goal of MEND was to establish a state in the Niger Delta for the tribal group, the Ogoni people. The conflict between MEND and the Nigerian authorities killed over 150 people. In 2008, MEND attacked oil pipelines and an oil platform, costing hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil. MEND actually had naval forces that were capable of cutting off 10% of Nigeria's oil production in one fell swoop. The end goal of MEND was to establish a state in the Niger Delta for the tribal group, the Ogoni people. MEND was also a militant Christian organisation that bombed mosques in what they called Operation Save Christianity. Since the end of MEND, which I'll explain below, other smaller terrorist groups have continued to operate in the Niger Delta, such as the Niger Delta Avengers. You may be thinking at this point, where the truck is the Nigerian government at? The Nigerian state has limited resources. It has cash flow that is very dependent on oil prices, which are currently not as high as they were before the GFC. Resources are often more limited due to the daylight robbery conducted by Nigerian political elites. Millions of state revenue goes missing seemingly every month in scandals that the Nigerian public, over half of which are in extreme poverty, are sadly very used to. Given these constraints, it makes sense that the state is pursuing a not very expensive, reactive rather than proactive option for reducing violence in the Delta. Introducing the amnesty program. Instead of establishing the infrastructure for everyone to succeed in the Niger Delta without needing to resort to violence, the government established the amnesty program. The government has been giving rent payments and $42 a month living expenses payments for militia who surrender and give up their weapons. For starters, these payments were and are significantly not paid and often wind up being amounts much smaller than designated due to factors such as embezzlement. Again, this is how Nigeria works, money mysteriously disappears. The government has at least been trying to rehabilitate and demilitarize the now 30,000 people who have signed up for the amnesty program. But money has also disappeared in the rehabilitation component of the program. According to a panel established in 2010, just 20% of the Nigerian government's spend on the rehabilitation program for ex-militants actually went to the rehabilitation of said ex-militants. The rest went to contractors and consultants, and presumably some of it went mysteriously missing. If this was charity money, people would have been outraged and pulled the money, but since it's government money of a not very democratic government, nobody can really do anything. The amnesty program has been further hampered by a lack of private sector involvement, hiring ex-militia, for example. This is totally in their right, but it has meant that employment of ex-militia is restricted to finding government departments to house them or in turning them into non-violent entrepreneurs, which has had some level of success. Furthermore, although the $42 per month payments can possibly support those currently in the amnesty program, what about the younger generation that has not done any crimes to begin with and don't have access to any supports? The government has not solved the most important problem and reason why people join the militias in the Niger Delta, which is poverty. More needs to be done to enable economic growth and the chance for a good future for young people in the Niger Delta. The poverty experienced by people living with oil pipelines running through their neighbourhood is something I'd like to emphasise. All of Nigeria lacks a social safety net for people under financial stress. It is hard to find out what the social security payments to poor Nigerians amount to because 1, the BBC articles on it seem to be only in Pidgin. 2, the local news articles assumed a lot of prior knowledge on the social security system. 3, and most importantly, the government website about it doesn't actually work. Taking some guesses, it seems like social security payments were stopped due to rorting of the system by people who were hard to trace due to lack of unique government identifier numbers. This is an incredibly shocking collective punishment that hurt some of the poorest people in the world. But thankfully, the government has reimposed a 3-month safety net that is $15 per month for households earning less than $2 per day. Officials anticipated that this would amount to 67 million people benefiting, but I can't find any data about how many people are actually benefiting. The big change with the new system is that Nigerians must have some kind of access to technology in order to get a Nigerian identification number, NIN, and a digital bank account to link the payments to. This excludes some of the poorest people in the world, especially older Nigerians. And after 3 months of teeny tiny stipends that average about 50 cents per day in US cents, it sounds like you're back on your own, kid. You always have been. The money pipes, oil pipes, run right through places where people are barely surviving on incomes less than $2.50 per day. This is a map of oil fields. There are a few gas fields thrown in there for some reason as well. I don't know why. Notice there are a lot of them. With all the billions that oil companies are making, you'd think their altruistic side would show, and the surrounding area would be super economically prosperous, like it is for citizens of Qatar, Saudi Arabia, or the Emirates. Well, no. Here is a map of multidimensional poverty. The red represents people living on something like $2.50 production power parity per day or less, or that live on marginally more than $2.50 PPP per day, but have virtually no chance of ever getting out of the poverty that they are in because of extremely limited access to infrastructure and education. As you can see, it's pretty common for 20+% of the population around the oil pipelines to be in extreme poverty. And this is a photo taken by a vice photographer showing how intertwined the oil pipelines are with people's life. This is the most incredible photo I've ever seen. The color, the humanization of the girl walking, the dilapidated building behind her, the Shell umbrella, and the heat coming off the pipeline that itself is in the middle of what is obviously arable land, but for the pipelines and Shell getting in the way of that. The result of the amnesty program has seen 30,000 militants avoid long, arduous sentences. Unfortunately, only 2,700 guns have been confiscated. I assume this means that some militants left the guns they were using with the militia, meaning that the militia can continue operations pretty seamlessly. Indeed, the amnesty program started in 2009, and the latest data I could uncover said that in 2021, 600 people died in militia-related conflict in the Niger Delta. This is down from 1,000 per year, as the estimate of the Nigerian government was back in the early 2000s, but very far from zero. And violence has fluctuated as high as 1,000 deaths from militia-related violence in 2019. The harm reduction approach of the amnesty program is commendable. Most of us know by now that larger prisons and longer sentences are not the way to actually reduce crime. This is true. And it is also true that the government needs to be much more proactive in providing the infrastructure and services needed for the younger generation to prosper without resorting to violence. And as for what happened to MEND, that terrorist organisation that I mentioned, well, it declared ceasefire in 2015, and in 2022, Tom Polo, the now ex-leader of MEND, signed a contract with Nigeria to protect some of the pipelines it used to try to destroy. A couple of months ago, the government gave Tom Polo an award recognising his contribution to the security of the Nigerian state. Nobody said that Nigerian politics was boring.